Welcome back to Be Free Cycling. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into something every cyclist worries about: bike security. And specifically, we're looking at a lock that claims to be impenetrable, the On-Guard rock-solid U-lock. To see if it actually lives up to the hype, we're going to check out some real-world testing footage from the awesome folks at Burn Peak Express on YouTube.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim for sure. And that footage is, well, it's pretty impressive. But maybe we should start with the basics. What exactly are we looking at here?
Right, so going by the specs on Amazon, it's a pretty classic U-lock design, about 3.5 inches by 6.9 inches,
Yeah.
with a really thick 14-millimeter shackle. But I think the real standout feature has got to be this thing called the quattro bolt locking mechanism.
Oh, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
really
right.
clever design. So instead of just securing the shackle at one point, like most U-locks, this mechanism uses 4 bolts. It's like creating 4 separate locking points, so it makes it way harder to pry or twist the lock open.
Exactly. And then on top of that, there's this angle grinder resistant coating. I mean, angle grinders are like the ultimate bike thief tool. So I'm really curious how this coating is supposed to work.
Well, the exact details, those are kind of a trade secret, but from what I can tell, it seems to be this rough, almost like a rubberized texture, and it's designed to mess with the grinder's cutting wheel. And that's where that Burn Peak Express testing comes in.
Yeah, they actually put it to the test. In the video, they've got this bike locked up to some stairs for stability, and they're using, a standard cutoff wheel on an angle grinder.
And even the YouTuber, I mean, he seems pretty skeptical at first, but the second that grinder makes contact, sparks are flying everywhere. It's so loud. And then the lock barely has a scratch on it.
It's kind of crazy to watch. The grinder just starts eating itself while the lock just sits there, almost like it's mocking it.
Yeah, and later on in the video, he peels back that rubberized coating, and you can see the lock underneath totally undamaged. It really makes you think, what's a thief supposed to do when their best tool is useless?
Yeah, I mean, do they just give up? Do they try to target a different part of the bike? It really does make you wonder how effective this lock could be at stopping theft.
It definitely seems like it raises the bar for bike security. And actually, the Amazon reviews seem to back that up. There aren't a ton of them yet, but they're super positive.
There's this one review from Janet Casey that really stood out to me. She talks about how tough the lock feels and how much more confident she feels knowing her bike is protected.
Yeah, and she also mentioned how easy it is to use, which is important for any lock, but especially one that's this heavy duty. I mean, you don't want to be messing around with a complicated lock when you're just trying to lock up your bike.
Speaking of heavy duty, it's worth pointing out that the Rock Solid is actually pretty lightweight for the level of security it offers. It comes in at just under 3 pounds.
Oh, that's a good point. You get all that security without having to carry around a ton of extra weight. But of course, all of this comes at a price. This lock is definitely an investment. $249.95.
Yeah, that's a pretty hefty price tag. So the big question is it worth it?
That's what we're going to dig into next. We'll look closer at what this level of security really means. Take a deeper dive into those Amazon reviews and see if we can figure out if the On-Guard rock-solid U-lock is really worth the investment.
Okay, so we've seen this On-Guard Rock Solid can stand up to a pretty serious attack from an angle grinder. But I'm curious, could this actually, change the game when it comes to bike theft?
Well, that's a really interesting question. You know, if a thief's main tool is suddenly useless, they're going to have to find another way. It's almost like an arms race. Security measures are always evolving alongside theft
I
tactics.
see what you mean. So could this lock actually cause a decrease in bike thefts? Would thieves just move on to easier targets?
It's possible. If enough people start using locks like this, thieves might just avoid bikes that have them. They might go for bikes with weaker locks instead, or even bikes that aren't locked up at all.
Yeah, but wouldn't that just make thieves find new ways to break these tougher locks? I mean, criminals are usually pretty resourceful.
That's true. There's always that risk that thieves will find new tools or techniques that can get past even the toughest security. But the important thing here is that this On-Guard rock-solid lock really does make things much harder for thieves.
Right, it makes stealing a bike that's locked up with this a much bigger risk.
Exactly. And just that increased risk might be enough to stop a lot of thefts.
So it may not be totally foolproof, but it seems like a pretty good deterrent. But let's get back to those Amazon reviews for a minute. You said they were mostly positive, but were there any common themes or any concerns that stood out to you?
Well, besides everyone praising how tough the lock is and how easy it is to use, a few people did mention the weight. Even though it's pretty lightweight for how much security it offers, it is almost 3 pounds, so that's something to keep in mind, especially if you have to carry it around with you.
Yeah, that makes sense if you're commuting a long way or if you have a smaller bike frame. That extra weight could definitely be a problem.
Right. And a couple of reviewers were also a little worried about the keys. The lock comes with 5 keys. But some people were concerned about losing them, since replacements aren't that easy to get.
Oh, that's a good point. That's something to think about with any high-security lock. You should probably keep a spare key somewhere safe, just in case.
Definitely. But overall, the feedback from people who actually use the lock seems to agree with what we saw in that Burn Peak Express test. This lock is incredibly tough. It's pretty easy to use, and it gives you a lot of peace of mind.
But that peace of mind comes with a pretty big price tag. So let's address the elephant in the room, that $249.95. Is this lock really worth it for most cyclists?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And like we said, there's no simple answer. It comes down to your own needs and what's important to you.
Okay, so what are the main things someone should think about when they're trying to decide?
Well, the first thing, and probably the most obvious, is how much your bike is worth. If you spend a lot of money on your bike, the cost of this lock might seem pretty small compared to how much you'd lose if it was stolen.
Right, it's kind of like insurance. You're paying to know that your investment is safe.
Exactly. But if you have a cheaper bike, or if you live in an area where bike theft isn't really a problem, then you might be fine with a less expensive lock.
So you're basically weighing the cost of the lock
Yeah.
against how likely it is that your bike will be stolen.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Because this lock isn't just about protecting your bike, it's about how it might affect bike theft in general.
Right, we talked about that ripple effect. If a lot of people start using these high security locks, it could discourage thieves and maybe even reduce the number of bike thefts overall.
That's the idea. It sends the message that stealing bikes is getting harder, it takes more time, and it's riskier. And we've seen that this lock can turn an angle grinder, which is a thief's go-to tool, into a useless, sparking mess.
So you're not just protecting your own bike, you're also helping to make the whole cycling community safer. It's like a group effort to make bike theft less appealing and less profitable.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and it's a really interesting idea. What if we could make bike theft so rare that cyclists don't have to constantly worry about it?
That would be amazing. But realistically, even with the best locks, there's always some risk. There's no such thing as perfect security.
That's true, and that's why it's important to have multiple layers of security. Don't just rely on one lock, no matter how strong it is.
Okay, so what else can people do to protect their bikes?
Well, on top of using a high-quality lock like the On Guard Rock Solid, you could also use a second lock, like a cable lock or a chain lock, to secure your wheels and your seat.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about where you lock up your bike? Does that matter?
Definitely. Always lock your bike in a well-lit area where people can see it. Thieves are less likely to target a bike that's out in the open, where they could be easily seen.
So no hiding your bike in a dark alley, no matter how tempting that might be?
Exactly. And if you want to be extra careful, you could even get a GPS tracker for your bike. That way, if it does get stolen, you have a better chance of getting it back.
Those are all good tips. It seems like the best way to keep your bike safe is to make it as hard to steal as possible. The more difficult you make it for a thief, the more likely they are to just give up and go for a different bike.
That's right. It's all about making it harder for them and having multiple layers of protection. And that brings us back to the On Guard Rock Solid lock. It's not a perfect solution, but it's definitely a strong deterrent. And it can be a big part of your overall strategy for keeping your bike safe.
Okay, so for people who are still undecided, what's the final verdict? Is the On Guard Rock Solid U-Lock worth it?
Well, if you have an expensive bike and you live somewhere with a lot of bike theft, and you just want the most peace of mind you can get, then yes, this lock is worth thinking about. It's a top-of-the-line product, and the price reflects that.
But if you don't have that much money to spend, or if you don't think your bike is that likely to be stolen, there are other really good locks out there that offer a good mix of security and affordability.
You're right. The most important thing is to be proactive about your bike security. Do your research, and choose the lock that best meets your needs and your situation.
So we've talked about all the features, seen the crazy testing, heard what people are saying about it, and even thought about how the On Guard Rock Solid U-Lock could actually change the whole bike theft game. But I think it's time to get down to the real question. Is it really worth that $249.95?
It's the question everyone's asking, right? And like we've been saying, there isn't one perfect answer. It depends on what you need and what's most important to you as a cyclist.
Okay, so let's try to break it down. What are the big things someone should be thinking about when they're trying to decide?
Well, the first thing, and this is the most obvious, is how much is your bike worth? If you put down some serious cash for your ride, The price of this lock might not seem like that big of a deal, especially compared to how much you'd lose if someone stole it.
Right. It's like you said before, it's like an insurance policy. You're paying for that peace of mind knowing your bike is safe.
Exactly. But if you have a bike that wasn't that expensive, or maybe you live somewhere where bike theft isn't a big problem, then a less expensive lock might be all you need.
So it's all about balancing how much the lock costs with how likely it is that your bike will get stolen.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because this lock isn't just about keeping one bike safe, it's about how it might affect bike theft overall.
Right, we talked about that ripple effect. Like if enough people start using these really secure locks, it could make thieves think twice and maybe even bring down the number of bike thefts.
Exactly. It's sending a message to thieves that stealing bikes is getting harder and taking longer and just becoming riskier. And we saw with our own eyes how this lock can completely shut down an angle grinder, which is what most thieves rely on.
So it's not just about your own bike. It's also about being part of a safer community for all cyclists. It's like working together to make bike theft less appealing and less profitable for thieves.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. And it's a really exciting possibility. Imagine a world where bike theft is so rare that cyclists don't even have to worry about it anymore.
That would be amazing.
Hmm.
But realistically, even with the toughest lock, there's always going to be some risk.
Yeah.
No security is perfect, right?
That's true. And that's why it's important to think about bike security in layers. Don't rely on just one lock, even if it's a really strong one.
Okay, so besides a great lock like the On Guard Rock Solid, what else should people be doing to keep their bikes safe?
Well, you could use a second lock, something different, like a cable lock or a chain lock. That way you can secure your wheels and your seat, too.
That makes a lot of sense. And does it matter where you lock your bike?
It definitely does. You always want to lock your bike in a well-lit area where other people can see it. Thieves don't like to target bikes that are out in the open where someone could easily see them.
So no hiding your bike in a dark alley, no matter how tempting that might be.
Exactly. And if you really want to go all out, you could even get a GPS tracker for your bike. So if it does get stolen, you'll have a much better chance of getting it back.
Those are some great tips. So basically, the best way to keep your bike safe is to make it as unattractive to thieves as possible. The harder it is to steal, the more likely they are to just move on to a different target.
Absolutely. Make it a challenge for them and have multiple layers of protection. And that's where the On Guard Rock Solid comes in. It's not a magic solution, but it is a really strong deterrent, and it can be a key part of keeping your bike safe.
So for those still on the fence about this lock, what's the final verdict?
If you've got a high-end bike and you're in an area with a lot of bike theft and you want the best possible protection, then yeah, this lock is worth considering. It's top of the line and you get what you pay for.
But if you're on a tighter budget, or you don't think your bike is that likely to get stolen, there are other good locks out there that might be a better fit.
Absolutely. The most important thing is to be proactive about your bike security. Do your research. Choose the lock that's best for you and your situation.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of bike locks. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little inspiring.
It's always fascinating to explore how technology and security and human behavior all intersect. And remember, the more you know, the better you can protect your ride.
And until next time, stay safe, ride free, and keep those bikes locked up tight.